What if the biggest, most earth-shattering events in history weren't inevitable? I'm talking about the Russian Revolution, that bedrock event of the entire 20th century. What if it wasn't about fate, or class conflict, or unstoppable economic forces?
What if it was just choices?
Exactly. What if it hinged entirely on cynical, contingent political choices made by just a handful of people, sometimes fueled by pure deceit?
That's a powerful question to start with.
Well, we believe that some books must be challenged. For this critique, we're using a pretty structured approach.
It's a step-by-step critical thinking framework. We map the author's claims directly to their evidence, drawing on the work of people like Richard Paul and Linda Elder.
We also apply an intellectual framework from the works of Mortimer J. Adler.
And we use the Golden Rule and even the U.S. preamble to identify any, let's say, ethical asymmetries in the narrative. It all builds toward a balanced, logical conclusion.
And to help you navigate this really complex revisionist work, we're talking about Sean McMeekin's The Russian Revolution, a new history.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation, which is powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
Okay, so our mission today is to give you the shortcut to being well-informed on this. It's a massive narrative political history spanning the late imperial period all the way through the Civil War.
McMeekin breaks it down into four main parts. You have the background, then the disastrous build-up to 1917.
Then the Revolutionary Year itself, and finally the absolutely brutal aftermath.
The book came out for the 2017 centennial, and it makes no secret of its purpose. It is a powerful revisionist history.
It is. The traditional view always says the Tsar's Russia was structurally doomed, right? A backward state that just had to collapse.
And McMeekin just flips that on its head. His whole strategy is to show how Lenin and his inner circle, these elite, high political actors, exploited the chaos.
And used foreign support to seize control.
Right. It makes the whole story about agency over destiny.
Okay, let's unpack that central thesis, because that is a massive claim. McMeekin argues pre-war Russia was actually recovering significantly.
He really does. He points to things like rapid industrial growth, the development of local governments, the Zemstvos, and serious attempts at land reform under Stolypin.
He's basically saying the country absorbed the shock of the 1905 revolution and was on a real path to modernization.
And this point is critical, because if Russia wasn't structurally doomed, then the catastrophe can't be explained away by some inexorable social force.
Instead, the book places the blame squarely on contingent decisions.
Number one, entering World War I, and then number two, the catastrophic political miscalculations made by everyone after the Tsar abdicated.
So if it wasn't fate, what was it? The book hammers this point home again and again. The October events were not a mass revolution.
No, not in the sense of broad forces demanding Bolshevism. He calls it a coup.
A surgical seizure of power, done by a very narrow social base at precisely the moment the Provisional Government was at its weakest.
It was much more about opportunistic timing and disciplined force than any rising tide of popular support.
And he brings evidence. He has this compelling section challenging the ingrained view of Tsarist military incompetence.
Right. He uses newly examined military records to argue the imperial army actually performed better than we often hear.
Better how?
Especially against Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. There were significant, if very costly, tactical successes, like the Brusilov offensive.
Things traditional histories tend to gloss over because they're so focused on the early defeats by Germany.
Exactly. And this shifts the entire narrative. If the army wasn't structurally doomed to fail, then the morale collapse needs a different explanation.
And that's where he brings in the agitation.
Yes. He contends that the devastating collapse of morale on the front line was a direct consequence of deliberate, persistent, and frankly successful agitational work by radicals.
Specifically the Bolsheviks inside the trenches, not just exhaustion from the war.
And here is where it gets really compelling, and for many, very controversial. The foreign enabler.
The German
money. McMeekin takes the older research on German financial support for Lenin out of the historical footnotes and puts it right on center stage.
We're talking about more than just the infamous sealed train.
Oh, much more. We're talking about continuous funding, millions in gold marks, channeled through intermediaries. He treats it not as some side curiosity, but as an absolutely crucial enabling mechanism.
So he's suggesting that without that massive external cash injection,
the Bolshevik Party's ability to maintain its vast propaganda network printing, countless newspapers, funding its agitators, would have been basically impossible.
So the German High Command essentially purchased a weapon to take Russia out of the war.
And that weapon was Lenin.
Now, if we look at the intellectual logic of the book, you can see just how tightly McMeekin structures his case. He's excellent at clarifying what led to what.
He traces these very concrete actions to highly disproportionate political results.
Exactly. She shows a clear line. The targeted propaganda to demoralize the army, the relentless undermining of the provisional government.
And the exploitation of every crisis over land and food. It led directly to this small, disciplined party, gaining leverage far beyond its actual popular support.
The structure of that argument forces you, the listener, to consider contingency. The idea that individual, deliberate choices matter immensely.
Which is a powerful challenge to those simplistic Marxist destiny narratives.
So if we apply a critical thinking lens here, McMeekin is actually very clear about his assumptions.
Very. He assumes that structural conditions were secondary, and that human agency, the choices made by Lenin, Kerensky, the German General Staff, was primary.
He focuses so heavily on unintended consequences, like how the German money funded a regime that became hostile to all of Europe, or how Kerensky's attempts to look strong just opened up space for radicals.
And by doing that, he prompts us to test every single causal claim he makes against the evidence he provides.
So I think the overall appraisal is that McMeekin is a clear, powerful explainer of one very specific interpretation. He defines his question clearly. How did a radical minority hijack a great power?
And he provides a detailed, evidence-rich answer to that specific question. He makes a very coherent case for political failure over historical inevitability.
But that same focus, that razor-sharp selectivity, is also what brings us to the critique.
When you decide to prioritize political agency, you inherently create blind spots regarding deeper social issues.
Right. We need to put on our critical thinking hats now and examine those biases. Reviewers, particularly those from, say, the socialist left or social history backgrounds.
They argue that McMeekin's intense focus on elite manipulation comes at a huge cost.
Which is?
Neglecting deep-seated social dynamics. He's criticized for downplaying genuine pre-war unrest, the endemic land hunger among the peasants, and the crushing social inequalities that have been building for generations.
And there's a major point of academic friction on that frontline demoralization point.
A huge one. It's just too simplistic to attribute the total systemic breakdown of an entire army solely or even primarily to Bolshevik agitation.
Reviewers argue this neglects the brutal, dehumanizing, and frankly endless reality of years of stalemated industrial-scale warfare.
When millions are starving, ill-equipped, and seeing staggering casualty rates, you can't just chalk up the systemic breakdown to a few pamphlets. The hardship made the pamphlets appealing in the first place.
And there's also the question of ideological caricature.
Yes, methodologically, critics argue that McMeekin often paints Lenin and the Bolsheviks simply as violent conspirators.
Which neglects the complex ideological appeal their promises held, right? I mean, when people are facing total chaos, the Bolshevik program promising immediate peace, immediate land, and bread.
It held a powerful, tangible appeal to masses of workers and soldiers. Reducing that to mere conspiracy neglects the core reasons why millions eventually fought and died for the Red Cause.
This seems like a good place for a pause. A mindful moment, if you will.
It is. It's important to pause on the book's insistence that history could have gone otherwise. This powerfully challenges deterministic thinking. It forces us to recognize personal and institutional responsibility in politics.
The question for us today is, where are small groups with clear strategies shading outcomes in ways that appear inevitable, but are truly contingent on calculated collective choices?
And that reflective habit is what our channel, Mindful Moments, specializes in. We use book-based analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts to train attention on how these narratives shape our moral and civic imagination.
Okay, shifting to the ethical dimensions, let's put the Bolshevik methods under a spotlight. Applying the golden rule is, well, it's simple.
Would the Bolsheviks accept the methods they used? Deceit, foreign backing, coercion, shutting down rival presses, using armed force to override elections, if those methods were directed against themselves?
And the answer is clearly no.
It's a compelling lens. If we measure the post-revolutionary trajectory, McMeekin describes mass death, economic collapse, the deliberate suppression of all pluralism.
If we measure that against the ideals of, say, the U.S. preamble, which aims for justice, domestic tranquility, general welfare, and liberty.
The historical outcome looks ethically catastrophic. The trajectory runs directly contrary to all those ideals.
However, a truly rational analysis requires us to avoid a lopsided judgment.
What do you mean?
While the book powerfully indicts Bolshevik methods and their results, it tends to go a little easy on the Tsar's regime.
It gives far less equivalent scrutiny to the massive injustices, the corruption, and the long-term imperial oppression that characterized late Tsarism.
Which is what drove many people to desperate revolutionary acts in the first place.
This creates what we call an asymmetric ethical judgment.
Exactly. The critique of Bolshevik violence is comprehensive and, frankly, accurate. But the lack of equivalent moral scrutiny on the pre-existing system makes the overall ethical verdict on 1917 feel incomplete.
You have to apply the same harsh moral light to both sides.
And that asymmetry really defines the whole academic debate. On one side, you have McMeekin emphasizing that the events of 1917 were primarily a contingent coup by a disciplined minority exploiting chaos.
And on the other side, the alternative view insists it was a genuine, chaotic, and necessary revolution driven by overwhelming mass discontent, with the Bolsheviks simply being the most effective vessel for that discontent.
This difference extends to the foundational view of Russia itself. McMeekin sees a state that was partially recovered, capable of self-reform, with its problems exaggerated by politicians.
Whereas the alternative view sees a deeply crisis-ridden state, where generations of inequality and repression had created an engine for inevitable rupture, with World War I merely acting as the spark that finally lit the powder keg.
So this brings us to our final synthesis. The book is an incredibly valuable case study precisely because it's so provocative.
It forces you to weigh the power of specific contingent human choices against the idea of structural historical necessity.
And by utterly refusing to romanticize revolutionary violence, McMeekin really fulfills his goal of making us think harder about historical causation and responsibility.
And just to be clear, this conversation-style critique draws on a systematic framework that maps authors' claims to evidence, applies structured critical thinking tests, integrates classical intellectual traditions, and foregrounds ethical asymmetries without reproducing copyrighted text.
The aim is not to replace the book.
Not at all. The aim is to model careful, rational engagement so that each reader can exercise independent judgment about historical truth and moral responsibility.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.